Technology has had an unusual and profound impact on humans and humanity from the very start. In fact, it's actually very difficult to have any conversation about the intersection of tech and community without rolling the tape back to the very beginning of it all. We have to go back to a time before there were computers or cell phones, before there was Facebook and Netflix, which is kind of hard for some of us. We actually have to go back to a time when modern humans didn't even walk this earth for this story to sink in. So I'm going to start us off by turning the clock back some 300,000 years. Now, that's the blink of an eye as far as the universe is concerned. It goes by just like that. But it's an almost unfathomably distant time in our past when viewed from a human perspective. And I mean unfathomable. Actually think about it for a second. What does it mean to say that something happened 300,000 years ago? The chances are you can't quite hold it in your mind. Maybe your mind goes blank. And that's actually a really big problem for the story that I want to tell, because it hinges on having a visceral feeling for just how long this dance between tech and community has been going on. It's been going on for our purposes forever. Now, what's going on here is that being human comes with a whole set of constraints. Some of them are physical, some of them are cognitive. This is a cognitive constraint. Being able to conceive of very long periods of time or very large numbers is not something we're particularly good at. We can see everything from about a quarter of a second up to about a lifetime or so, and outside of that, it gets pretty blurry pretty quickly. 300,000 years is way outside of that window. But I have a solution. We're actually going to borrow from something that we've been doing for about 300,000 years. We're going to use a tool to help us overcome this constraint. And by the way, that's what tools and technology have been all about over the years. It's been about how do we overcome the constraints of being human, to be able to lift things that we couldn't lift, to be able to see things that we couldn't see, or to understand things that we can't understand. Let's see how that might work here. I want you to envision just for a second holding a push pin in your hand. Feel its weight. Think about how long it is. Now, don't poke yourself, but think about its length. And now I want you to think about taking that push pin and putting it on a football field near the goal line, and then taking as many push pins as you need to stretch that line all the way to the opposite goal line, 100 yards distant. Now, if a push pin is about the length of a human life, a modern human's life, that football field, 100 yards, is about 300,000 years. That starts to give you a picture of the time frames that we're talking about. Okay, so back to our story. What happened 300,000 years ago? Well, from our perspective, everything happened because that's when Homo sapiens started. At that point, 300,000 years back, Homo sapiens appear on the scene for the very first time. And that's a big deal for those of us sitting here today. Now, there were several physical characteristics that defined early humankind, but what I'm more interested in is a couple of other characteristics that stick with us to this day that completely changed the world. The first was that even back then, we loved our gadgets. We were tool makers. We liked technology. We liked to make stuff that helped us overcome the constraints of being human. The second is we were very unlike other creatures in that we were social animals from the beginning. We got together in groups and we cooperated. So tool making, cooperation were hallmarks of early humans and actually survive with us today. In fact, you might recognize them by different terms: technology and community. Now, this would be an interesting enough story if technology and community both evolved separately at the same time and turned into the world we have today, but that's only half of it. The thing that I'm most interested in is the interplay between these two. In fact, looking back on the history of technology and community, it's really hard to say whether it was humans in groups that formed technology or whether it was technology that formed community. Let's look at some of those early tools in the early story. We're starting all the way at the end of the football field here, and take a look at what this might look like. So the very first technology that pre-humans explored were stone tools. It was a great starter tech, and it was a great way to extend the power of the arm. Added an additional fulcrum here so you could get more force at the point where you hit an object. This actually dates back into the pre-human era, 2.6 million years ago. That's 9 football fields back. Now, those of you who are technophiles will be horrified to know that there were not many updates to the products back in those days. So it actually took many hundreds of thousands of years before we saw some other technologies that were just as profoundly as important. The one I want to spend a couple of minutes on is this. So I think of this as technology one. This emerged about the same time that humanity did, 300,000 years ago, and that's probably not a mistake. This was a profoundly important technology. Now, you remember that early humans actually did get together in groups and spend quite a lot of time together out of the gate. They actually were pack hunters, so the hunt was about community. Well, using controlled fire back about 300,000 years ago also gave them the ability to cook the food that they hunted. So the hunt was a community activity. Around the fire, they gathered in community to cook their food, and of course they ate it around that fire as well. So fire was actually the first technology of community. I'm going to give you a couple of examples of why this was so important. Okay, so first of all, first example, I talked a little bit about the fact that cooking food made it possible for humans to get together in community around the campfire. That ended up being critical to the early bonds that were created, and some of what we see today in community can be seen around that early campfire. The second example, and this is maybe the most important, it's actually widely believed now that the ability to get a lot of calories by hunting and cooking contributed to early humans' brain sizes increasing very rapidly over relatively few generations. And it was a bigger brain that made it possible for us to be social animals. It actually turns out it's really hard cognitively to be social. We have to keep track of all kinds of relationships. Does she like him, or am I still angry at that guy? It's really hard from a brain perspective to actually keep track of all that. One more example. The other thing that fire did was help us overcome a built-in constraint that is bad night vision. We're actually quite bad at seeing in the dark. Well, what fire did was allowed early humans to extend the day well into the nighttime. And you can actually envision this, anybody who spent any time around the campfire, sitting in community, telling stories. And it's very, very likely that that actually is the beginning of culture. That's probably where early language started. That's probably where storytelling started. And that's pretty fascinating. So fire was an amazing first technology. And what happened next as we marched down the field was basically the same model repeated over and over and over and over again. So every technology that we created from that point on was first about solving for some basic human need, like cooking food. It was about optimizing that, making it better, getting better at it over time, and then doing it again and again and again and again. And that was the pattern that unfolded. What I'm most interested in is that it also turns out that just about every technology you can imagine influences community in some important way. So we talked a little bit about fire. Let's go through a couple of other quick examples. So we're actually needing to march quite far down the football field to get to this next technology. That's really not the technology number. I just added that because I thought it was fun. But it turns out that most of technology that's been created actually is created in the last yard of that football field. And that's true here of agriculture. This was about in the last 3 or 4 yards, about 9,500 BC is when it first appeared on the scene. On its face, it's a technology about food, and that's true, but it also enabled a small group of farmers to supply food to a large group of specialists. Specializations came out of that, and through that, we had towns that got bigger and bigger and eventually turned into cities, which were hotbeds for community. So agriculture in many ways is actually a technology of community. How about the wheel? It actually came after agriculture, weirdly enough, 3,500 BC. That's about the 2-yard line. So yes, it's a technology of transportation, helping get things and people from here to there, but it also allowed humans to spread out over a greater geographic area and come back together in community. It facilitated community. The wheel is a technology of community as well. And then there's the light bulb. Now we're in the last 150 or so years, the last few inches on the field. And this is one of my favorites because really what this does is the same thing that fire did for us so many years ago. Yes, it helps you to not stub your toe when you get home late at night. It also makes it possible for you to read a book if you want to do that after the sun sets. But really what the light bulb enabled was groups of people to get together at night in community. It's another technology of community. So hopefully you can kind of see these interactions. And now we're literally in the last 4 inches or so of the field. And this is where we get a little bit of a plot twist. The last 4 inches of the field, the last 100 years or so, has seen more development of more technologies than the previous 300,000 years combined. Included in that has been a new understanding of the way that we work and the way that technologies have been built over the years. And one of the most important discoveries that's informed that new understanding was this simple molecule. It's dopamine. It's a neurotransmitter that was discovered about 50 years ago. And this discovery fundamentally changes everything we know. Here's why. So if you think about the previous model of building technology, it was about achieving some basic human need or helping to overcome a deficit in being human. Well, now what we know is that it works something like this. I invented technology like light. It enables me to get together with my friends at night, which feels good. That feel good is dopamine or some other feel good chemical neurotransmitter in our brain. And that causes me to say, you know what, I should do that again. That was good. And it causes me to go back and think about maybe I should change this light. Maybe I could make it brighter and have more people over, to iterate on technology and improve it. So this is all well and good and actually quite interesting. What's problematic about it is that we learned a few other things. For instance, it's possible to skip the middleman, and it's possible to interact with brain chemicals directly. We see this in their purest forms in injecting and ingesting various drugs and compounds. Here's a list of just a few of them that more or less interact with brain chemistry directly. And we know this is pretty dangerous. But in many ways, this is actually the devil we know. What I'm more concerned about is this. When you're interacting with technology today, clicking likes on websites, watching videos, spending time on sites, shopping, you're probably not thinking a whole lot about the neurotransmitters that are happening in your brain. But you know what? The people who run those companies are thinking about it. They're actually building their products to optimize for a certain neurotransmitter release, because that makes it so that you'll come back and buy more or click more or like more. And we've gotten to a point where it might just be that those needs being served by those companies actually don't match what's good for us as individuals or communities. So it might be good for that company that when you gather in community online, you like and comment a lot, but it might actually not be so good for community in the real world. And that is a really big problem. So we started this story around the campfire, and I want to end it by talking about fire in another way, because today we're kind of playing with fire. It's actually a dangerous and pretty uncertain time. I'm not entirely sure what happens next that gets us out of this mess, but it's pretty extreme. However, I have a lot of room for optimism, and there's 2 main reasons for that. The first one is that there are a lot of good technologists out there, companies and projects that are being run, that are thinking about this in an ethical way. They're thinking about how can we actually optimize for good community outcomes instead of this neurotransmitter event, more clicks and likes and page views. Those projects are worth following, they're worth backing, they're worth paying attention to. And the second thing, and I'm going to leave you with this, is that we actually have a lot more control as consumers than we think that we do. And a lot of the old technologies that we've maybe shoved aside are actually still pretty good technologies. Now, this is crazy coming from a technologist and somebody who loves gadgets, but I think we should probably use these new technologies a little sparingly. And I would actually suggest that you consider this. Every once in a while, close the laptop, put the phone down, turn off notifications, turn off Facebook for a little while, and maybe just go back to some of the original technologies. Maybe go back around the fire in community and tell some stories. Thank you.